In this video lecture, we'll look at awareness and self-awareness. We'll start by considering some of the unconscious processing that we do, and then consider how things we are unaware of can influence our behavior. And finally, we'll look at a test for self-recognition known as the red dot test. We've already had a look at some unconscious processing, and recall that when we were studying perception, we considered Helmholtz's unconscious inference hypothesis. This is the idea that a lot of our perceptual processing happens before we have conscious awareness of what we're perceiving. So our unconscious perceptual system determines how far away objects are, how big objects are, whether or not they're moving, puts this information together, and projects a conscious experience of perception. There are other unconscious perceptual processes happening, and some of these are quite interestingly seen in a rather bizarre neuropsychological condition known as blind sight. I won't go into details about explaining this neuropsychological condition. Rather, we'll watch a short video, again featuring Valyanar Ramachandran, as he explores this fascinating neuropsychological condition.
Graham is one of the world's few known blind sight patients. He is blind, yet he can see. This paradoxical condition shows just how much our brains get on with running our lives without us even being aware of it.
When I was 8, when I had the accident, it was a road accident that caused the brain damage, I literally used to walk into lampposts. I ran into, you know, these huge great pillars you get in stations. I ran into one of those one day.
The road accident caused colossal damage to the main visual centres of Graham's brain. He can see to his left, but he is blind to everything on the right, in both eyes.
If you put an object in that part of the field and ask him what is it, he has no idea. He cannot perceive it consciously.
Down.
And yet the remarkable thing is, if you move this object, he will tell you which direction it's moving.
Right.
Even though he cannot see the object.
Up.
Blind sight is this term introduced by Larry Weisskranz to describe the ability of people like Graham to detect things but not to be aware of them. So very, very different from what we would normally call vision.
Colin Blakemore is one of several Oxford scientists for whom Graham's mysterious abilities raise baffling questions about consciousness.
I mean, blind sight is extraordinary when you see it. It's shocking. I think it's shocking because it brings home that we manage our brains without consciousness to some extent. And that leads to the question, well then,
Why not everything?
why not everything? And why do we need consciousness for certain things? What is the extra gloss that consciousness gives, if anything, to our actions?
For nearly 20 years, Graham has been the willing subject of a range of experiments that have yielded astonishing results.
You can see things over here.
Oh yes, I can see.
I'm going to move my hand across. You tell me when it appears, when it comes into view.
Now.
Very precisely as it enters the seeing part of your field.
Yeah.
And if I just hold it over here and you look there, you can't see anything?
No.
How about now?
You're moving it up and down.
But you're seeing it.
It's very easy for me to say to you, oh, I saw that move up, Colin. Yeah. And as soon as I say that, you're going to say, ah, he can see. No, I can't.
Okay, let's see if we can just test that a bit more formally. What I'm going to do is make squares that appear on the screen, and they will move either upwards, downwards, or out to the right. You've got to keep looking at this point all the time, so it's in your blind visual field that this is happening, where you're not supposed to be able to see anything at all. But what I want you to do is just to guess what the direction of motion might have been, even though you can't see it. I want you to tell me each time whether you're aware of anything having happened, okay?
Down, not aware. Down, not aware.
Not only does Graham see nothing on the blue side of the screen, He's not even aware of anything happening there at all.
Not so sure of that one. I think it moved to the right.
Yet miraculously, he guesses the direction of movement correctly.
If there's one thing that this phenomenon of blind sight teaches us, it is that vision is not entirely seeing, that there can be a disconnection from the capacity to respond to visual information and the actual act of being visually aware of something. Those two things can be separated and probably are in our everyday lives. But the problem is that obviously we're not aware of the things that we're not aware of. We just don't know the extent to which they play a part.
It's almost as though the patient is using ESP. He can see and yet cannot see. So it's a paradox. It's almost like science fiction. How is this possible? Well, if you look at the anatomy, you can begin to explain this curious syndrome. It turns out from the eyeball to the higher centers in the brain where you interpret the visual image, there's not just one pathway, there are two separate pathways which subserve different aspects of vision. One of these pathways is the evolutionarily new pathway, the more sophisticated pathway if you like, that goes from the eyeball through the thalamus to the visual cortex of the brain. Now you need the visual cortex for consciously seeing something. The other pathway, which is older evolutionarily and is more prominent in animals like rodents, lower mammals, birds and reptiles, goes to the brain stem, the stalk on which the brain sits. And from the brainstem gets relayed eventually to the higher centers of the brain. Specifically, the older pathway going through the brainstem is concerned with reflexive behavior, orienting to something important in the visual field, making eye movements, directing your gaze, directing your head towards something important. In these patients, one of these pathways alone is damaged, the visual cortex is damaged. And because that's gone, the patient doesn't see anything consciously. But the other pathway is still intact. And he can use that pathway to guess correctly the direction of movement of an object that he cannot see.
Graham often likens his vision to that of reptiles, whose dependence on unconscious blind sight is powerful evidence for them not having consciousness.
A lizard, if it wants to catch a fly, for example, doesn't actually have to see a fly, it doesn't have to recognise a fly, it just has to be aware of something moving. So if it can detect motion moving to the right, to the left very quickly, it can catch its prey, so to speak, it can eat. And that's very much, I guess, what blind sight is. I'm aware of some of these more primitive functions, but I don't actually see to a right. So I suppose me and the lizard are distant cousins.
One of the goals of neuroscience is to understand which parts of the brain are dedicated to what function, how different mental capacities map onto different pathways and different neural circuits in the brain. And surely this fascinating syndrome is going to help us understand not only the nature of seeing, not only the division of labor between these different pathways, but the question of what is consciousness? What does it mean to be consciously aware of something? Why is one pathway alone conscious, whereas the other pathway behaves like a zombie that's trapped inside him, that's unconscious? The syndrome is so strange that when it was initially reported, people didn't believe it, and there are some people who still don't believe it. But in a sense, it's not that strange if you think about it, because we all suffer from a form of blind sight. In a sense, we experience blind sight all the time in our daily lives. For example, as I am driving this car and having this conversation, all my attention is on the conversation, on the person next to me. And in fact, I'm not conscious of what's going on around me. Even though I'm negotiating all this traffic, avoiding obstacles, avoiding that car on my right, avoiding the car on my left, that's all being done in parallel by another part of my brain, and it never emerges into conscious awareness unless something very strange happens, like a big truck passes by, I might notice it.
Blind sight enables us to steer our way successfully through the world as if on autopilot. Without this zombie in our brains acting on our behalf, the world would be a treacherous place to move around in.
This is a really fascinating neuropsychological condition, and it demonstrates quite exceptionally this idea of perception without any awareness, how our perceptual system can function fairly well without any conscious intervention. So while we have a number of unconscious processes, our unconscious mind also influences our behavior. One way to think about this is to consider how we quite often operate automatically without thinking, our behavior being influenced by a number of things that we're not conscious of, but that at any time we can take cognitive control. So for example, if you're walking, you have a walking speed that's preset. If you want to walk faster than that, then you need to think about it. You need to take cognitive control. You may reflexively want to respond to a stimulus in a particular way, but our cognitive system allows us to think about our responses and control those responses. One way cognitive psychologists like to think about the idea of unconscious processes is to distinguish between cognitive products and cognitive processes. Memory is a good place to look at this. One way we can think about memory is we can think about memory as an object, as a cognitive product. So if I ask you, what did you have for breakfast this morning? You have this thing in your head, a memory, that you can retrieve and answer that question for me. So we think of memory in that sense, we call it episodic memory, as being an object, something contained within your cognitive system, a product of your cognitive system. But memory is more than just objects. Memory also acts as a tool. Memory guides our behavior and influences our behavior even when we're not directly aware of it. And this is the idea of cognitive processes. And a lot of our cognitive processes, as we saw in perception, we are not aware of. So we have this idea, we'll look at it in more detail when we study memory, this idea of implicit memory that guides our behavior without us consciously thinking about the influence it's having on our behavior. There's different types of implicit processing available, different types of unconscious processing that we have. Probably the simplest is classical conditioning. We have, you recall, Pavlov's dog here who has been trained to salivate in response to a bell. So when you ring a bell, Pavlov's dog begins to salivate because that bell has been associated with the delivery of food. This is not something you consciously think about. We have a number of responses that are classically conditioned. We don't think about them. They happen reflexively. Classically conditioned responses are sometimes thought of as the simplest form of unconscious responses that we make. But we can also have our responding primed in various ways. The most common is repetition priming. If you've processed a stimulus once, then processing again shortly after that initial processing, that second processing time will be much faster. It's easier to process something a second time. And we call that repetition priming. But we have more than just repetition priming. There's other types of priming. Context itself can serve as priming. So our environment can influence our behavior even though we may not be consciously processing stimuli in the environment that are influencing us. This was nicely demonstrated in a study by Bateson in 2006. In Bateson's psychology department, they had a little coffee corner where people could go to make their coffee in the morning. And the way the rules worked at this coffee corner was the coffee was free, but if you wanted milk, then you were supposed to pay for it. The idea was that people who didn't take milk in their coffee shouldn't be paying for the milk. So if you took milk in your coffee, you were supposed to put some change into a can. And when you ran out of milk, you could dump money out of the can and go purchase more milk. And that way, only the milk drinkers would be paying for the milk. Above the coffee stand was a bulletin board. And what Bateson did was he started posting pictures right above the can. One week they'd be flowers, the next week they'd be eyes, and then he'd alternate back to flowers and then eyes, and continue to alternate every week between pictures of flowers and pictures of eyes on the bulletin board. And at the end of every week he'd empty the can and count how much money was inside of it to see if people were contributing to the milk fund. On the bottom of this axis we have the amount in pounds. It was a British study. Paid per liter of milk consumed. And we have time on the x-axis here in weeks. What we can see here is a remarkable pattern. Every time eyes are posted on the bulletin board, you can see that the amount of money in the milk can goes up. With flowers, it goes down. Eyes, back up. Flowers down. Eyes up. All the way through 10 weeks, we see this alternating cycle between flowers and eyes, causing an alternating cycle between how much money is being paid in the milk can. An example of how context is affecting behavior. A social psychologist would tell you that the eyes give us an unconscious impression that we're being observed. And when people are being observed, they tend to respond in a more honest way. Now, a third type of implicit processing are motor skills. For example, we often say you never forget how to ride a bike. We call this procedural memory. And procedural memory is not the kind of thing that is easy to describe. If I want to remember whether or not I know how to ride a bike, the way I test that is I get on a bike and see if I can still ride it. And these skills, we'll see this later when we study memory, often are unconscious. So we're unaware of a lot of our cognitive processing. But one of the things we are aware of, and a key aspect that relates awareness to consciousness, is our own self-awareness. So a key component of consciousness is being aware of ourselves. I'm going to show you another video clip here. Again, this is from Valyana Ramachandran. And again, we're going to be looking at another neuropsychological condition. This one's known as anosognosia. And here we have somebody's conscious awareness basically fooling them into believing that they're not ill. I'll let the video set this up for you.
Mr. Staten, I'm back again. Dr. Ramachandran, I have a couple of questions for you. Can you use both your hands?
Yeah.
Yeah, you can use both your hands. Okay. Can you clap?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, that's fine. There's not the slightest flicker of movement in his left hand or his left leg. But you ask him, can he use his hands? He says yes. Or he'll say, my left hand is slightly weaker. Ask him, can you clap? He vehemently says yes. And he starts flailing his arm and, in fact, patting his chest as though he was clapping. Now, patients with left hemisphere damage whose right hand is paralyzed, or indeed a majority of patients with right hemisphere damage and left arm is paralyzed, will not do this. They'll say, I can't clap, doctor, my left arm is paralyzed. That's the natural response that you expect. But these patients with this extraordinary syndrome, which we call anosognosia, where the patient is denying or playing down the fact that the left arm is paralyzed. Okay. Can you show me? Can you touch my nose with your right hand? Touch my nose. Yeah. Excellent. Now, can you do it with your left hand, please?
I think so.
Okay. Can you do it for me?
I'll try.
Okay, that's fine. Are you doing it?
Wait a minute. I'm calling up my left hand.
You're calling it up? Okay.
Get in there.
Okay. All right. Is it touching my left?
No.
My nose?
Yeah, I'm still talking to it.
You're still talking to it?
I'm explaining to it what to do.
You're explaining to it what to do. Okay. Mm-hmm. Is it listening?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
But it's reacting slowly.
It's reacting slowly. Okay.
It's tired, I think.
It's tired. Okay. Thank you very much. Many of these patients, the remarks they make to account for the left hand's failure to perform, the statements they make often sound a little bit humorous, often tinged with a perverse sense of humor. And you start wondering about some of Freud's ideas about humor itself being used as a defense mechanism. Is that what the patient doing?
Ella Sinclair is another stroke victim with a paralyzed left side. She also has anosognosia, and she too seems to use humor to deny her paralysis.
Now you remember when I first saw you, I was asking you whether you could use your left hand. What did you tell me then?
I think I told you yes.
You told me yes, you could use it.
But I lied.
You lied? Well, why did you lie to me?
I don't know. You wasn't smiling at me, I guess.
Because I was smiling at you?
You were not.
I was not smiling at you. Okay, so that's why you were lying. Okay. But you remember you said that several times. I kept asking you. And you always said you could use your left hand fine, that there was no problem.
Before I had my stroke, I could, but I can't now.
You can't now.
One of Mrs. Sinclair's comments was so odd that it was hard to know whether she was joking or not.
The other striking thing we saw in Mrs. Sinclair, when we held her right hand up to her and asked her, whose hand is this? She said, it's my hand. When I held her left hand up in front of her, she said, that's my husband's hand. And she remembers vividly seeing her husband's hand.
Do you remember at that time I showed you your hand? Did I show you anybody else's hand?
Yeah, you showed me my husband's hand.
I showed you your husband's hand. You remember that clearly, do you?
Yeah.
Okay.
I've been living with him 27 years. I know his hand.
You know where his hand is. You've been with him for so many years. That's true, yes.
We never showed her her husband's hand. In fact, he was not even in the room. Now, to understand what's going on in these patients, you have to look at the left and right cerebral hemispheres of the brain. Now, everyone realizes, of course, that there's specialization. The left hemisphere is specialized for language, and the right hemisphere is thought to be specialized for seeing faces, seeing facial expression, and to some extent for emotions. But I think there's an even more fundamental distinction between the two cerebral hemispheres, and that might help explain this peculiar syndrome we're seeing in these patients. There is a tremendous need in each one of us to create a coherent belief system to maintain a sense of continuity to our own lives. And this is done largely by the left hemisphere, this creation of a belief system. And when there are new experiences, the left hemisphere folds these experiences into the pre-existing belief system. If something doesn't quite fit the story, the strategy of the left hemisphere is to deny the anomaly, is to pretend it doesn't exist, is to brush it under the carpet. And this is what we call denial. Now, counterbalancing this is the right hemisphere, which has the opposite tendency. Whereas the left hemisphere tries to preserve the model, preserve the belief system, preserve status quo, the right hemisphere is your devil's advocate, constantly challenging the status quo. And when the discrepancy or anomaly becomes unbearably large, or becomes too large, then the right hemisphere forces a complete revision in your worldview, in your belief system. Now, what has happened to these patients is the left hemisphere is intact, so it's engaging in denial, as it does in normal people, but she doesn't have a counterbalance. There's no right hemisphere challenging the story, doing a reality check, and therefore they become more and more deeply delusional, and in fact there is no limit to the delusions that you can elicit, including a claim that her arm belongs to her husband, or saying, yes, I can see my finger touch your nose.
Ramachandran has found support for this radical theory from evolutionary biologist Robert Trivers, who is a world authority on self-deception and lying.
To me, what's striking about Ramachandran's work is that he's located a particular kind of self-deception in a particular place in the brain with the pleasing implication that the two hemispheres may normally act together in a way where one is tending to generate more self-deception, the other tending to correct for it. And with anosognosia, you get the self-deception unchecked by the parallel hemisphere. What is striking is how blatant and obvious the self-deception is. They deny the very condition that they express.
When the stroke occurred, could you use it?
Now, one way to think about anosognosia is to realize that what the patient is doing is engaging in precisely the kinds of denials and confabulations and rationalizations that we all engage in.
I did not have sexual relations with that woman.
It was Freud who first pointed out that we use all these mental tricks to defend the ego, as he said. When we are confronted with something that's unpleasant or threatening to your self-esteem, you need to lie.
Listen to me. I'm going to say this again. I did not have...
The trouble is, the emotional centers of your brain cannot conceal the fact that you're not speaking the truth, and your face starts leaking traces of deceit. So anybody watching you, the muscles are slightly different when you're lying.
Different on each side of the face, reflecting the complementary roles of each side of the brain.
It's almost humorous, sir.
If you put a false expression on your face, a forced smile, it will tend to curl up a bit more on the right side of the face because it's being run by the left hemisphere. The right hemisphere is more involved in a natural facial expression, so if I could smile warmly at you now, it's supposed to curl up a bit more on the left side because it's supposed to be run by the right brain.
You know, I have acknowledged that I made a mistake, said that
It was interesting to me that President Clinton, when he came out and started apologizing, initially there was a facial imbalance. The right face was into it. The left face said, "Get me the hell out of here." And then he goes before ministers and says, "There's no simple way of saying I've sinned."
But after I testified,
Both faces were now into the latest show.
I don't think there is a fancy way to say that I have sinned.
The bizarre syndrome of anosognosia, I think, gives you an experimental lever to understand these very fundamental aspects of human nature. The consistency of beliefs that we hold about the world is something we take for granted. It's the basis of a rational, sane existence. Even that is called into question in these patients. You cannot talk to a patient who has the syndrome of anosognosia, somebody who's perfectly lucid and intelligent, telling you that this arm belongs to her husband. You cannot confront such a patient and not come face to face with some of the basic questions in philosophy. Some of the most fundamental questions you can ask yourself as a conscious human being. What is the self? What is a belief? What do you mean by willing and action? What brings about the unity of your conscious experience?
The exciting thing for me is that scientists can now begin to raise and answer some of these lofty questions about how the brain generates conscious experience and generates your sense of self. Wouldn't it be exciting if all this happened in our lifetime, that consciousness finally understood itself?
You can see that our brain sometimes plays games with us, that our conscious experience is again enabled by our brain processes. So in the case of anosognosia, the brain is simply telling the person that you are not paralyzed and that hand must be someone else's. So we see this woman who believes that her own hand must be her husband's hand. Normally we think of our self-awareness as being really that critical component of consciousness. In order to test for self-awareness, psychological scientists have come up with tests for self-recognition. You remember in the last video I asked whether or not a newborn baby has consciousness. Well, it turns out that newborn babies don't have self-recognition, and we might actually be able to make the argument that they are not fully conscious in the same way an adult is. In order to determine whether or not someone has self-awareness, to use a test called the paint test, or sometimes it's called the red dot test. What happens is a young child comes into a developmental psychologist's laboratory, and without them really noticing it, a small little red blotch is dropped on their nose. And then you put the child in front of a mirror to see how they react. This child is looking at the interesting person in the mirror with the red dot on her nose. She doesn't seem to be aware that that red dot is actually on her nose. If she was aware, she'd be trying to wipe it off. That's what we'd do. If we looked in a mirror and saw something on our face, we'd try to wipe it off. But she seems to think that the person in the mirror is somebody else. So she's failed this self-recognition test. Usually a child has to be between 16 and 18 months of age before they'll pass this paint test, before they recognize that the person they're looking at in the mirror is themselves. So you can see how we can refer to this as self-recognition. Self-recognition in photographs is a little more difficult. It's easier to recognize yourself in a mirror because you have this joint movement that's happening. As you move, the person in the mirror is also moving synchronously with you. It's harder to recognize yourself in a picture, and children are typically a little bit older, probably closer to 2 years of age, before they recognize themselves in pictures. It's interesting that humans are not the only species that have self-recognition. Chimps and great apes have self-recognition. You can see in this picture they've placed a tag in the fur of the chimpanzee, and he's looking in the mirror, poking at it, trying to remove it. If you did the same thing to monkeys, not great apes, but monkeys like this rhesus monkey, you can see that the rhesus monkey, like the child we saw before, is reaching out for towards that interesting person that he's seeing in the mirror. You get self-recognition in other species as well. Elephants pass the paint test. Large sea mammals like orcas and dolphins are able to pass this test. And interestingly enough, some birds can pass this test as well. You may or may not know, but crows, blue jays, and their relatives, magpies, are all very intelligent animals, and magpies have passed this test. We'll see this in this video.
Humans aren't the only ones aware of their own reflection. Birds can recognize themselves as well. Researchers have shown this for the first time by placing different colored dots on magpies' necks. The birds could only catch a glimpse of the stickers if they looked in the mirror. Here you can see a bird scratch its neck when it notices a brightly colored sticker. Some magpies tried to remove the sticker with their beaks, while others used their feet. Birds that were tagged with black spots that blended in with their feathers didn't react when they looked in the mirror. Magpies have bigger brains than other birds that allow for lots of connections between different brain areas. Researchers think this may explain why they can recognize themselves while other bird species may not be able to.
So you can see that self-recognition occurs in other species. Having self-recognition is not sufficient to be considered conscious. However, I think we can argue that self-awareness, because it's a key component of consciousness, that if you are conscious, you should also have self-recognition. Next up, you should probably read the 3 Scientific American Mind articles that go with this module, the article by Pollan, Koch, and Nichols.